Hello, everyone. I warmly welcome you all to our webinar, Conflicts at Crossroads, Transregional Security Dynamics in the Indo-Pacific, organized by the Indo-Pacific Circle in collaboration with the Center for Northeast Asian Studies, Jindal School of International Affairs. This event serves as a platform for fostering meaningful conversations and exchanging regional perspectives from South and Southeast Asia on the evolving nature of cross-border conflicts, migration, and trans-regional security challenges in the Indo-Pacific. Our distinguished panelists for today are Mr. Anshuman Chaudhary, Associate Fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. He primarily works on Myanmar, Northeast India, Southeast Asia, Indian foreign policy, and patterns of armed conflict. He's also a member of the Indo-Pacific Circle. Our second panelist is Dr. Samrat Sinha. He's a professor at Jindal Global Law School and is a visiting researcher at the Peace Center, Nagaland. His research revolves around peace building, humanitarian action, and access to healthcare in border regions. And our third panelist is Mr. Satria Rizaldi, founder of the Regional Security Society, a policy advisory network of early and mid-career thinkers focusing on evolving strategic affairs in Southeast Asia. His research interests lie in maritime security and humanitarian intervention in Southeast Asia and the broader Indo-Pacific region. With that, I would now urge Dr. Pathak, Associate Professor and Founding Director for the Center of Northeast Asian Studies, to address the panelists and the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Samba. It's truly an honor to have this esteemed and diverse set of panelists. The topic, of course, is very important and very pertinent, especially in today's world, when there are concerns about the situations in the Middle East, the Saharan region, the Korean Peninsula, or former Soviet, the world, even in the Western world. And these are cases in point. In more than 25 years, peace and security as concepts have undergone several changes, and they've been redefined beyond traditional topics such as weapons of mass destruction. Now, the Indo-Pacific becomes very important because it's a hotbed of conflicting goals and aspirations. Therefore, it's an important case in point. This webinar seeks to analyze some of the trans-regional security dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. And thank you once again, Indo-Pacific Circle, CSDR, and esteemed panelists for taking out time to join us. The Center for Northeast Asian Studies of OP Jindal Global University is a research center which was established in 2021. At CNEAS, we study the countries of the region, the PRC, the ROC, South Korea, Japan, and North Korea, with fine lenses to offer understandings beyond what is provided by Western literature and theories of international politics. Tools such as track 2 discussions, seminars, lectures, primary research, historical and archival studies, along with the reliance on the languages of the region, are used to understand international politics. We explore dimensions of not just what is traditionally known as hard power, but also all other forms of power in international relations. So we are grateful once again to collaborate with the Indo-Pacific Circle, and we are truly honored to have our esteemed panelists. I'll not take up much time, and I think we can proceed directly into the discussions. So I would request our first panelist, Mr. Anshuman Chaudhary, to please take over.
Thank you, Dr. Pathak. I'm very happy to be sharing this panel and being invited to this panel by IPC and Jindal. And I must also say I'm glad that IPC is collaborating on this panel with Jindal, given the fact that I've had a long association with Jindal in various forms across various departments. And I do believe it is one of the places that's doing cutting edge work in terms of research, writing, publications, across a wide range of domains, in many ways, which distinguishes it in a way that no other university is doing in this country. So I'm glad that IPC was able to forge this collaboration. I hope this collaboration also sustains in a way beyond the webinar. And Amba, thank you for inviting me. unfortunately, I'm in Cambodia right now. I have a dinner to attend right after, and I had informed Amba before this. I would like to stay on for as long as I can after I speak. I will try to, but I might have to leave. And I promise to catch up after that on what is spoken. I'm really interested to hear what Satria and Samrat say. That's why I'll ensure, even if I drop out, that I listen to the remarks from Amba and catch up later. So essentially, before I go into what exactly trans-regional conflicts or conflicts at crossroads in the Indo-Pacific would mean, I would probably like to tease out the very idea of what do we mean by crossroads in a way, or what do we mean by trans-regional spaces? These seem to be big words, but what do we really mean by these when we break them down or sort of disaggregate them? In the context of Indo-Pacific, it's very fascinating. If you zoom out and think about it, the Indo-Pacific itself is a trans-regional space. It's a trans-regional construct. It's one big crossroads in a way. A construct that brings together two pre-existing regional constructs together, right? In many ways, a meta-geography, if you may. So that frame of understanding Indo-Pacific, in my view, becomes useful to understand why trans-regional spaces become important in shaping larger geopolitical dynamics and security dynamics in the world today. And ultimately, it's fair to discuss Indo-Pacific as one big macro concept, right? Which we always have been doing, which we have been doing since the last 4 or 5 years, since it became in many ways a zeitgeist of modern geopolitical thinking, and the mood, almost in many ways, the mood of foreign policy circles. But ultimately, this is what it comes down for me, that the Indo-Pacific is a sum of its parts, right? And if the parts are not stable, if the parts are not integrated, and if the parts are not peaceful, then a pursuit of peace and stability across the Indo-Pacific will become futile. And the sum of its parts will not add up to be the whole, is what I mean. So I think it's good to talk about, disaggregate the concept of Indo-Pacific, and good to talk about the various smaller trans-regional spaces and the various smaller crossroads that make up the Indo-Pacific. So these days, I think I've been spending a lot of time thinking about borders, and having realized that work on borders, the literature on borders is already vast, and a lot of people have done thinking around borders from various frames, along various tangents. But what I feel is that today we are in a very, very fascinating moment when we are seeing borders being reinforced and subverted at the same time. There's two parallel processes going on where, because of new forms of emerging technologies, be it messaging apps, social media, internet, etc., we are seeing a transbordering of spaces where borders are being transcended. But at the same time, we see that calls for harder borders, for more militarized borders, for fencing, for walls, is being renewed in many sense. So this is a paradox that probably needs deeper both theoretical and empirical scrutiny. And we're yet to understand how these two simultaneous and, I would say, rather contradictory processes would mean for global geopolitics. What I mean, though, as the baseline point here, is that borders are coming back into focus in whatever form they may be. And in many ways, borders are again shaping trans-regional spaces in ways that they haven't in probably the last 3 decades, especially after the end of the Cold War, when there was a period of integration, stability, and this, I would say, in retrospect, an illusion of enduring peace. But now I think that illusion has been broken in many ways, as we see renewed conflict and war across the world, right? So, and it's not just about conflict and war, but we are also in a period of renewed disintegration, as I said. So this entire topic of borders, trans-regional spaces and conflict and crossroads becomes even more crucial, as Dr. Pathak also referred to some of the conflicts that are underway. So I would say we are entering in many ways a new uncharted territory within the post-Cold War period. within the post-Cold War sort of mood frame of mind. And it is within this larger context that I would place my remarks today. And why I say borders? Why are borders so fascinating in today's context of understanding trans-regional spaces within the Indo-Pacific particularly? Is because, borders can be two things. One is borders can be instruments of integration, right? Borders can be bridges. At the same time, borders can be dividers, and they can be specific, not just dividers in themselves, but also instruments of division, where the political elite can use borders to divide communities, to divide countries, right? So it can go both ways. What I mean to say here is that we have the option of sort of shaping and reshaping borders in a way that is constructive to sort of to the larger sort of common dream of the Indo-Pacific, if I may, in that sense. I would like to talk about, these are all abstractions. Good to talk about abstractions and sort of conceptual, in many ways, conceptual explorations. But I think it's better to talk about specific case studies and specific examples. So I would probably allude to 3 specific examples in this case, and then leave it at that. To back up basically what I was rambling about right now, which is number 1 is something that I study very closely, Myanmar, right? A country that I study very closely. And why is Myanmar important when we talk about the topic that we are discussing today? Number 1, Myanmar's geography is literally the textbook definition of Crossroads, right? I would say it sits very awkwardly between 2 regions, South and Southeast Asia. And even the literature on area studies, if you may, be it South Asian area studies or Southeast Asian area study, has still not reconciled with what Myanmar is or where Myanmar is. There is still a very much open debate of how do we see Myanmar in this sort of geography of East Asia, Southeast Asia, or Southern Asia, right? So with the Belt and Road Initiative, with India's renewed outreach to Myanmar in terms of its infrastructure push, and of course, the violent political churning that we are witnessing in Myanmar, in many ways, the tragedy that we are witnessing in Myanmar renews this question and makes these questions even more imperative to understand, right? But one thing that we have seen since the coup in Myanmar, which began in February 2021, it's going to be almost 3 years now, is that the crisis in Myanmar has significantly affected not just its immediate geographies, but larger Indo-Pacific politics, right? And this sort of substantiates my point, a bigger point that I want to make, which is that trans-regional spaces shape geopolitics in ways bigger than we might think, in ways more important and more significant than we might believe. When the crisis in Myanmar happened, one of the first things that happened was a collapse of ASEAN consensus, right? ASEAN has been divided on Myanmar in the past too. But the way it has been divided this time, I don't think we have seen that before, right? What then that led to were serious questions on what ASEAN calls ASEAN centrality, which happens to also be a core concept within the Indo-Pacific push of the US, of India, and other larger stakeholders of the EU. All of them constantly talk about ASEAN centrality, right? But the Myanmar crisis and the ensuing collapse of consensus within ASEAN, raised a very fundamental question about Indo-Pacific. Are the various parts of Indo-Pacific united or integrated enough for Indo-Pacific as a whole to operate? In fact, not just that, the Myanmar crisis also brought to question some fundamental normative values about the Indo-Pacific. It was a litmus test in many ways for the Indo-Pacific. What do we mean by Indo-Pacific values? Do we mean working with almost a genocidal military? Do we mean engaging with that particular coup regime for larger geostrategic interests? So what does it mean? What does it mean to be part of a loose coalition or a thought or sort of a grouping called Indo-Pacific and then deal with this kind of a crisis, right? So even within the Quad, for example, we saw divergent perspectives on Myanmar. In fact, within the Quad, in many ways, India stood out as the odd one out. Where the US and Australia took a similar position. The Japanese took a position which is not exactly similar to the Americans and Australians, but was far more closer to the position than India's. right? So in many ways, I think the questions that the Myanmar crisis raised on larger Indo-Pacific values, I think we need to talk about them more to understand how few conflicts in the future could shape Indo-Pacific as a discourse, right? The second case study that I want to allude to is Manipur, right? The conflict in Manipur, and this is interlinked with with Myanmar in many ways. And again, I'm going to ask the question: why should I talk about Manipur when I'm talking about Crossroads and trans-regional conflict, right? That is because it harks back to one of the points that I made in the beginning, which is that borders as bridges versus borders as instruments of division, right? Amidst all the clutter and all the noise and the violence and the social media narratives around the Manipur crisis, one thing came out very clearly, which was that the political class in many ways blamed the open border, the unfenced open border, for the crisis in Manipur. And this was a very deliberately sort of constructed narrative, right? So here we see a border that has actually served for decades, for centuries, as an instrument of integration, being reframed as an instrument of division. And now there are calls by the political class in both in Imphal and in New Delhi to fence that border, right? A border that was not fenced for God knows how many centuries is now being there are talks of fencing that border now, right? And of course, why? And Samrat would also talk more about this. He's done extensive fieldwork in the area. The excuse for doing that, for militarizing that border, is that we have complex security challenges in the form of drug smuggling, arms smuggling, etc., right? Which are definitely there. This is not undeniable, right? But the Manipur border is unique in the sense that it is more than just a political line on the map. It's in many ways tied to very complex ethno-political questions, right? In the sense that the Kuki-Zo community, which straddles both India and Myanmar along that border, do not want that border to be fenced, has never wanted that border to be fenced, because they see that border as an artificial dividing line that literally divides their own divides their home or their sort of homeland country, or divides their existence. And they have shuttled across this border since ages for routine familial activities, for trade, etc. And the Indian state remarkably recognizes that with the free movement regime, with the FMR, right? So this is a very unique and peculiar border. But now we see that there are discussions of those regimes of openness being reversed. Right? This is a specific case study, but it has bigger questions within it, right? In many ways, it portends a future, a very sort of, I would say, a bleak future of disintegration within the Indo-Pacific, right? So it begs us to think, in the 21st century, what do open borders mean, right? Or what do borders mean? The third sort of case study, or this is more of a reflection in many ways, introspective, or I would say prospective reflection, which is that when we talk about trans-regional spaces, in today's date, one of the things that we necessarily have to think about are future horizons of conflict along trans-regional spaces, and these are not traditional horizons. For me, the biggest future horizon of trans-regional conflict within the Indo-Pacific, and the biggest driver of future trans-regional conflict in the Indo-Pacific is climate. And this really cuts across the entire region, right? If you talk about micro-regional spaces, trans-regional spaces within the larger geography, it's common. It's a common problem, shared problem, that cuts across all of these domains, geographical domains, right? Either you be for example, the India-Bangladesh border, wherein renewed climate threats in Bangladesh would likely push an entire population across the border into India and create new conflict dynamics or reanimate older conflict dynamics. Or if you talk about the potential of conflict between the various small island developing states, or what we today call large ocean states, the Pacific island states, because of serious climate threats. So there is a potential of friction between them over competition of limited resources and waning resources because of climate threats, and renewed friction between them as a collective and larger powers within the Indo-Pacific, like Australia, New Zealand, EU, and the US, India, Japan, etc. Right? So what we see here is that climate not just destabilizing very sort of hyper-local dynamics of society and politics, but also larger dynamics of geostrategy and geopolitics in Indo-Pacific. And this is a topic, again, that needs deeper understanding, deeper studies. In fact, at Indo-Pacific, I think Indo-Pacific Circle, we some of us are currently working on a paper on large ocean states and how how future horizons of climate threats could affect the strategic environment and the security environment in the Indo-Pacific with respect to the large ocean states specifically. So these are some of the thoughts that I wanted to leave behind. A lot of them might seem like ramblings, vague ramblings, but I think these are things that I have been myself very preoccupied with of late in my research. After this, I'm heading to the Thailand-Myanmar border to continue my fieldwork there, and there's a lot of discussion there on how the refugee crisis, the refugee spillover from Myanmar to Thailand is affecting local border dynamics. In fact, this is a point that I want to make. The very last point that I want to make is that both Thailand and India had a very unique position on the Myanmar crisis for a singular reason: the border between them. Both these countries argued to the rest of ASEAN, not just to the US or the Western Alliance, but also to the rest of ASEAN, that look, we can't afford to take a similar moralistic pro-sanctions approach that the rest of ASEAN or the West is taking on Myanmar, because we share a border with Myanmar. So the border became a very clearly identified marker of geopolitical equations within the Indo-Pacific, larger geopolitical equations. So I think we need more sort of thinking on these. And yeah, as I said, I'll be happy to take some questions if there are. I'll try to stay on as long as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anshuman, for those thought-provoking ideas. It's really interesting how you see borders as bridges and as instruments of conflict and division. And I'll request the participants, the people who have joined us, to post their questions in the chat box, and we'll be happy to share them later. I will now request Dr. Samrar Sinha to please share his insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amba, and thank you, Anshuman, and also Satriya for being part of this panel, and for Amba and IPC for inviting me to be able to give this presentation today. And also thank you to Professor Manoj and Shriparna of the CNEAS for organizing with IPC such a wonderful and important discussion. And in my case, my presentation would in a way build on Anshuman's talk, especially the case study portion, because there are really a lot of significant points in the previous presentation on the ideas of borders and the way the Indo-Myanmar border has been shifting and changing, especially in the way we conceptualize the border. And in many cases, the conflict in Manipur is on which I'll be focusing, has very serious, all of these geopolitical shifts and all of the different political configurations have very serious consequences on the societies also who reside and are directly impacted by these shifts. So in the case of my presentation, it's going to be very, very basic in the sense that I'll be actually giving you an overview of the direct consequence of the conflict in Manipur, and which is based more from the perspective of not as much as what happened in terms of the direct violence, but there have been many consequences of this violence, and the way the violence is unfolding in a way reflects what the future of conflict in these border areas will also look like. And one of the reasons I think what's very important to note, especially in the case of Indo-Myanmar border, specific to the region Anshuman mentioned, is that actually the open border regime the area had become actually relatively peaceful, especially post 2010. So we have a very interesting time where there was a lot of progress that was actually made on the border, both in terms of infrastructure, in terms of gains of trade, in terms of people-to-people contact, many things. And there was a lot of dynamism on the Indo-Myanmar border, which unfortunately, as a result of the conflict, has been very severely affected. So in my presentation, and it's going to be a very brief presentation, and I'll stick as much as I can to the slides that I've prepared. It's basically a direct overview of what happens after the conflict, especially when we looked at it from a humanitarian perspective. And the presentation is actually based on data and findings from a very prolonged and protracted kind of, not exactly research, but let's say as part of the humanitarian response. I was involved with one of the responding organizations and was helping them consolidate some of the field data and collation of field data during the time of the conflict. So this process of humanitarian analysis and monitoring in the field went on for approximately 2 months over May, June, July. And it's done in partnership with with a consortium of local NGOs who are also working in the direct relief work that is still ongoing. So I'll be presenting the overarching results in a way and the overarching findings with a focus more on the public health part of how this conflict has become much more complex than when it started in terms of just pure, ethnic violence and armed violence, and that the level of complexity in the conflict has got accentuated as a result of many of these direct humanitarian impacts, which until now have been left relatively unmeasured. So I will just quickly transition to my slides and enter into my presentation. Yeah. So it'll just take me a minute to share the screen. Yeah. So I hope my slides are visible to the panelists and everyone present.
Yes, they are.
Okay. So today the title of my talk essentially is Forced Displacement, Humanitarian Action, and more or less reimagining the existing humanitarian architecture, which has emerged in the consequence and in the aftermath of this particular crisis. Yeah, so the sequence of my presentation, one, directly connected to the conflict, I will give an overview of the overall humanitarian context of the Manipur conflict. I will try and also provide a macro view of the situation of forced displacement that is still occurring as part of this conflict. Because we normally tend to look at humanitarian crises as an event which is in the immediacy of a conflict. But if you look at the patterns of displacement, it is actually a very protracted form of displacement, which is very episodic. So it's a very long-term and a very complicated crisis for this reason. So more of a macro view of actually what are the implications of this forced displacement, which is still a very unaddressed problem in the overall situation. Second, I'll provide a very quick snapshot of the situation and analysis of the IDP camps and the challenges being faced by the people who have been displaced, especially in terms of food security, nutrition, water, sanitation, hygiene, and livelihoods. And it'll build on building on that, we look at the impact of the conflict, especially on vulnerable groups. Following which I'll conclude with a kind of rethinking of the existing humanitarian architecture and also implications for conflict resolution and peace building. What does all of this mean for, or let's say, what is the way forward, if any? So just to conceptualize the crisis, I won't get into the causes of the conflict because a lot has been written about the conflict itself. But if we look at the overall burden of conflict from a more of a public health perspective, one of the serious consequences of this conflict is that there is a high variation in terms of the amount of actual information available on direct consequences of the conflict. That is in terms of fatalities and injuries. So recent information suggests, I mean, as of now, that approximately there have been 200 fatalities, but this number again is not an absolute number. It basically looks at victims who were part of the first wave of violence. And what we see is the transition of this conflict in a way from a kind of a riot followed by armed violence, followed now by a very different form of conflict where these ethnic borderlines have now become reified and they've become much more concretized. So you do see a demographic transfer in terms of the population, especially of Meiteis and Kuki-Zo community, where Kuki-Zo community from Imphal Valley has now come into the tribal dominated districts, and the Meitei community, especially from who were residing in the hill districts along the Myanmar border, have now essentially shifted into the Imphal Valley. And what you have in the current situation as we speak is essentially that the district boundaries have also undergone a kind of bordering process where these district boundaries between tribal and non-tribal districts are now in a way a kind of frontline or an ethnic frontline and an ethnic border, which is also shaping the nature of conflict as well currently. So an analysis, if you look at many of the conflict events that are occurring, a lot of it actually occurs very much along the borderline. This has become the epicenter in a way for of the contemporary type of conflict, which is also involving use of firearms. The other problem that has, of course, and this is in the absence of a systematic damage assessment report. In normally post-conflict situations, you do have very extensive damage assessments, which has not been done this time. And but one can estimate that there has been a lot of widespread damage to infrastructure, with approximately 5,000 to 6,000 houses that have been destroyed in this particular conflict, number of religious institutions, a number of Anganwadis, village infrastructure. There have been it's one of the more hidden parts of the conflict in terms of calculating the costs of conflict as well. So overall, if you look at the existing humanitarian context, this has been one of the most difficult contexts for the Indian humanitarian sector because the nature of the conflict is still ongoing. It is an unfolding and it's a conflict which, because of these borderlines, has also put a lot of constraints on the way humanitarian aid can actually reach the communities who've been affected from both sides. So both sides have been equally affected in many different ways, but humanitarian access is one of the more difficult things. And apart from this, you also see a lot of blockades, especially on national highways, which has become part and parcel of the conflict as well. So a lot of hidden costs in this particular conflict. What we also see in terms of conceptualizing the crisis is the escalation of armed violence, which is very much linked in a way to the circulation of very sophisticated arms. So more than, and this is there in the media reports, that more than around 5,000 weapons were actually looted in the first wave of violence. And the consequences of this kind of armament, where it's been decentralized and spread across all the communities, is now slowly unfolding. And an indirect measure in a way is the total number of firearm injuries that are now emerging as we speak on a periodic basis. In between, there has been a lull in the kind of direct confrontations, but that does not hold as we speak. Like slowly, there seems to be some kind of re-escalation. So daily occurrences of gun violence combined with mass protest, and these incidents, the most obvious incidents of violence, always get recorded in the media and reported very well, both locally and not so much on the national level. But if we look at the local newspapers, there is very good reporting of conflict violence in the ethnic enclave specifically by the newspapers and the local media of each community. So it's possible to create a picture of, at least some indexes of the overall trajectory of violence if we study the local media in detail. And we do have a conflict monitoring small initiative that is going on. So, but what of incidents that don't get recorded in the media? So the conflict also unfolds in very deeper, less visible ways, well beyond media coverage. And this is where the humanitarian sector actually, and that's the focus of my presentation, that rather than conceptualizing violence as direct violence, where we only look at firearms and use of sharp weapons and the kind of physical violence that is inflicted, it is the indirect consequences of the conflict where thousands of people are being displaced into these relief camps, which is part and parcel of the entire conflict system. So most of peace building narrative focuses on direct violence. And I think it's very important to look at all the different layers that this overall conflict entails. So when we look at one of the hidden consequences of the conflict is that this is a very complex humanitarian crisis. And it's a crisis of forced displacement. And just to give you some estimates, approximately 70,000 people, this is according to Sphere India, which is which coordinates something called the State Interagency Group, which is in Manipur, which coordinates between different humanitarian actors, and they come out with periodic assessment reports. So as for the latest assessment report, approximately 70,000 people are living spread across 325 relief camps since May. And this is within Manipur. And out of that, nearly 14,000 children of school-going age are still residing inside camps. So in terms of numbers inside Manipur, this is a very huge problem in terms of a human problem and a humanitarian problem. The second problem is that the key point here is that the displacement, when we look at the overall directions of forced displacement, it also extends beyond Manipur. And there are actually many humanitarian crises occurring in all the surrounding states as a result of the IDP flows that are coming in and which are still going on. So, for instance, if you look at official statistics from Mizoram, there are approximately 12,632 persons who were displaced into Mizoram from Manipur, especially from Churachandpur district, and as well as if you look at Tengnopal and some amount of displacement that has come in from Imphal Valley as well. So people, and especially from those border districts that I was mentioning around the front line. So around 12, in addition to 70,000 people, you nearly have 12,000 people inside Mizoram. And just the districts of Churachandpur, and if you take the displacement in Mizoram, accounts for approximately 48% of the overall burden of displacement, with additional displacement also occurring in Nagaland, nearly 5,000 people, Assam 1,500, and Meghalaya nearly 800. What also we must remember is that people who are being displaced and recorded as being in camps are a fraction of the overall flow of displacement, because there is a lot of displacement where people have resources and are not staying in camps. So there is an unrecorded displacement also, possibly taking the overall burden of displacement beyond maybe 1 lakh to 1,50,000 people who are not necessarily in camps but fled, but are not counted as internally displaced, because internal displacement data is mainly, I'm basing all of this on CAM data. So one is a humanitarian crisis which is visible. The second, a humanitarian crisis which is invisible and unrecorded. But within the overall conflict narrative, even the visible humanitarian crisis does not necessarily get major attention. Again, building on community data, if you look at another uniqueness of this particular displacement is that actually a bulk of the displacement and the vulnerable populations are essentially women and children who are living in the IDP camps. So their vulnerabilities are much more compared to other, if you look at other crises that occurred in India here, for instance, if you look at a gender analysis, a bulk of those living inside camps are essentially women, children, and the elderly, right? And this is as a result of the nature of the conflict dynamics, where a lot of the men are actually guarding their villages as village volunteers. So in the overall conflict system also, it's not that there are levels of vulnerability also that we have to cater to, and which needs to be Understood. So this is community data from IDP camps inside Manipur and Churachandpur. But if you look at a disaggregated data of nearly 10,000 people from the IDP camps in Mizoram, so out of 12,000 who are living inside the IDP camps or living in some form of displacement, out of that 12,000, 10,049, nearly 80, more than 81% of the overall displaced persons are essentially vulnerable communities. So if you look at the volume in terms of number of children, number of infants, school-going children, number of pregnant women, and so on and so forth, number of elderly, people with disabilities, the overall burden of the conflict gets magnified by several degrees. So what are some of the these particular impacts? I think one, that those in relief camps are most vulnerable. Second, there are a lot of institutional and financial bottlenecks when it comes to this specific crisis. One of the key problems that we are finding is that there is a huge funding shortfall in terms of the humanitarian spending for various reasons. So for instance, in Mizoram, the IDP community is actually very, very vulnerable, not only because they are living in very sparse and very remote camps, but also there is very little funding available to actually direct this funding into buying resources and so on and so forth for providing lifeline services for these particular communities. So there is a lot of funding shortfalls, and one of the more sad aspects about this entire humanitarian crisis is that there is very little national level response into this particular crisis in terms of supporting IDPs. And this is a complete contrast, for instance, to earlier humanitarian crises. Now, this can be attributed to many reasons, but one, of course, not only problems of geography, the second also is that in like a very simple problem, that if you look at the project proposals and the funding requirements of organizations who are responding to the Manipur crisis, especially civil society NGOs, in a simple thing is that in their project proposals, they might not include Mizoram into this particular humanitarian programming. As a result of which, the IDPs in Mizoram also they also lose out. So there are a lot of institutional and financial bottlenecks. So what is the situation analysis inside the camps? And of course, one, of course, is that there are, at the beginning of the conflict, a lot of medical issues were actually that emerged. And this is one of our partner organizations called NEST, which has been doing this continuous field surveys inside the IDP camps since the beginning of the crisis. So if you look at violence as a public health problem, it is one aspect. So violence and physical injuries is a very small part of this conflict. Rather, what is happening is that if you look at the various disease profiles, the situation starts worsening within these relief camps, because every single disease that is measured becomes an emergency for that particular family, because they have lost all the resources. They are not able to actually cope with many of the consequences of this conflict. So there's been, if you look at the profile of the data, you'll find that very serious medical issues, but these medical needs are unmet. So there is a lot of indirect deaths that are also occurring as a consequence of indirect impacts of this conflict. So for instance, if you look at the IDP population in the beginning, and this particular survey was initially done among around 213 IDPs, but now the total sample size has increased tremendously, and it's from 17 relief camps. Actually, the survey now is ongoing in 80 relief camps. And this survey data is then put into the local organizations who are doing the medical relief work. But this initial data at least gives you an idea that in terms of disease profiles, what is being unrecorded, for instance, is that the absence of dialysis machines, for instance. So that people who are inside camps are not getting access to dialysis. So a lot of these illnesses are getting accentuated across the board. Okay, both in Imphal Valley as well as even in the hill districts. So it's a common problem. And very quickly, so one of the key problems that tends to get ignored in the overall narrative of the conflict is that when we look at the issues of public health, And when we look at issues of measuring the impacts of these conflicts, there are a lot of impacts on vulnerable communities, and that education, livelihoods, health, food insecurity, water, sanitation, hygiene, and the conflict-induced inflation, that is the artificial price increases in goods and services as a result of the conflict, are all getting connected to each other. They're all becoming interrelated. So this is a major problem in terms of conflict resolution. So for instance, here's a picture of an example of a relay or of a petrol pump that is closed. Here is an example from a relief camp where a patient is actually living in isolation. So some of the views of the relief camps, I mean, when we talk about camps, as I was mentioning, you know, the impacts on children. Now, this protracted conflict, when people went into the relief camp, they thought that they will be there for not more than maybe a week. But now it's been more than 6 months. And the longer the humanitarian crisis, the worsening of all of the various outcomes and indicators on which we've been talking about. So there have been cases, unfortunately, of infant and maternal mortality as well in both sides, in both valley and hills, which again has not been well documented. But that's one of the most serious markers in terms of where humanitarian needs are remaining unmet. So this is just some examples of people's possessions. This is an example of a prescription actually from one of the relief camps. And you can see this is actually from Mizoram. It's a relief work being done by the NGO's coordinator. And when we talk about logistics, again, that's what I was trying to stress on, that these are crises that are very sparse, they're very decentralized, and they are highly complicated. I mean, this is the example, for instance, of the relief operation that I just showed you. The logistics of reaching there, it took them it's around 250-kilometer journey through this kind of road. So all of these things have to be taken into account when we are thinking of those final humanitarian outcomes. And unfortunately, the burden of this humanitarian action is now purely being borne mainly by the local NGOs and local civil society. So in thinking about, towards a new kind of architecture for humanitarian action and humanitarian innovation, in conclusion, I would say a couple of points. I think we need to rethink the way humanitarian action is being done. There's a need to support the local humanitarian actors in a very big way, systematically, and the need for a lot of external, especially I think one of the failures of this conflict has been the failure of corporate social responsibility, where a lot of CSR firms have the ability, the capacity, the willingness to actually come in and implement humanitarian programming, but they don't have it in their frameworks. Maybe it's an absence of data, but there are also other constraints, because this is not necessarily, these humanitarian issues are not necessarily a current priority. So the moment it becomes a priority, automatically we will hopefully have some kind of CSR funding. But as of now, the humanitarian funding at the local level is also now being stretched because of that it's already gone on for 6 months and there seems to be no end in sight. So you will see major strains. The second thing connected to humanitarian funding, of course, is the fact that the key impacts that are also occurring is in education and livelihoods. I think this requires a lot of serious consideration because it has massive implications for post-conflict rebuilding. The third and fourth points that I just thought of adding there is that we also need to redefine peace building here, and there's a need for also exploring traditional norms of conflict resolution and mixed approaches. Right. And the last, of course, is that all of this can only be done, I think, not necessarily through very high priority issues being put on the table first, but rather looking at low priority issues which are more immediate and more connected to immediate humanitarian needs. I think education, livelihoods, access to health, reductions in violence are some universal facets that are applicable across all communities who are in conflict. And it's essential to now use or at least leverage all of these particular developmental trajectories as part of the peace building matrix for this area. So beyond that, I'll just conclude here. And again, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present today. Yeah, so that's my conclusion. I'm not giving any specific answers, But in case there are any questions in the Q&A part, I'm happy to answer, including methodology, anything else. Yeah. I hope I'm audible and
Yes, you are audible.
okay.
I think there is a question coming up, but they haven't typed it yet. So, thank you, Dr. Sinha, for your insights and your approach of looking at violence, direct and indirect, and the humanitarian aspect of this problem. I would now request Satria to please take over and share your presentation. And I'll, in case we have any questions, I'll get back to you, Dr. Sinha.
Thank you.
Hello. Yes, first of all, thank you so much, Anshuman and Dr. Sinha, for a very comprehensive and solid academic exposures on your work, and also for Anshuman to cover most of the parts on the, from the helicopter view about the Indo-Pacific, conflict dynamics, Indo-Pacific, especially because Anshuman also speaks a lot about Southeast Asia, which helps me, which will make my presentation less effortful and is going to be very candid, going forward. Also, thank you, Dr. Simrat, for sharing experience. I would like to, first of all, congratulate IPC and CSDR for initiating such a wonderful webinar and very timely webinar also for the cross-border conflict in Indo-Pacific. There is no better time to talk about cross-border conflict such as now, because we are in the middle of intersections of war in the Ukraine as well, in the Palestine, Israel. With that comparisons, I would like to start my interventions. I would like to base my intervention in 3 key topics. And the first is about the situations in Myanmar, but I'm not going to talk about the inside story in Myanmar. I would like to touch upon the consequence of forced migrations in Myanmar in Southeast Asia. So I will respectfully differ or distinguish myself from the other panelists because I'm Southeast Asians. My expertise is only in Southeast Asia. So I would like to respectfully distinguish my explanations, not talking about the whole Indo-Pacific, but Southeast Asian view on Indo-Pacific. The second focus of my expositions would be on the irregular movement or mixed migrations in Southeast Asia, how regionalisms and regional governance in Southeast Asia operates to face mixed migration as its contributions within the Pacific regions. And also the last issue that I'd like to touch upon is the crucial one, the most crucial and recent one, which is the status of Timor-Leste in ASEAN and how it will contribute, how it will unveil in ASEAN's Indo-Pacific grand theater or a grand agenda. So with that, I'd like to break my point into 5 pointers. The first thing that I'd like to discuss is about the international agency in Myanmar and also outside Myanmar. Is it a prosper or wither? So I would like to begin with the most global, actor, which is the UN. And I think with the UN involved in the crisis in Myanmar, many questions, revolves around the academics and also policy debates with whether or not they bring cohesive coordinations or like coordinations intra-ASEAN. Because I've been working with ASEAN stakeholders, especially the ICHR and also the Indonesian government. We see the United Nations involvement, including the IOM and the UNHCR, as a mere ad hoc actor in the Myanmar crisis. As an academia as well, we hope that the UN could bring more of a diplomatic and political solutions, but instead they only operate as an actor. This is very important because by becoming an ad hoc actor, it will refrain them from reaching their own objectives in Myanmar, which is to provide 3 things: rehabilitation, resettlement, and repatriations. We see rehabilitations program has been burden to the government of Bangladesh and also to Southeast Asian nations. Resettlement is also being more or less burden to the Southeast Asian nation, also broader Indo-Pacific region, including in India and Pakistan, respectfully. But in terms of repatriation, so this is where the questions gets tasty. It always went hostile when it comes to repatriation. So for me, and also for general public opinion, repatriation is not a solution. It's not a virtually viable solution now in Myanmar. So ASEAN, the UN, all international agency needs to work on the rehabilitation and resettlement in terms of managing forced migrations. So because of these ad hoc postures, it also disrupts the way ASEAN functions here. The ASEAN and also SARC, and to some extent, but ASEAN mainly, following the UN mechanism as an ad hoc, because the ASEAN Charter, dictates, has a premise that it has to, work together with the UN mechanism. So it has, incredibly disrupt the relationship between ASEAN and South Asian countries, especially Bangladesh, which leads to the failure of diplomacies and humanitarian intervention. I think Anshuman and Sinha also explained about this, in comprehensive manner. But there are two major consequences of this. The first is the prolonged community disintegrations with Myanmar because of the lack of coordination. The second one is the very obvious one. It has deteriorated Bangladesh economic security and territorial integrity. So because of this, it has developed, to a more severe consequence diplomatically now between South Asian countries. And the second thing that I would like to expose in my presentations, probably because Anshuman is also working on ASEAN, this is a question that I always ask to ASEAN stakeholders when I engage in a meeting with the ASEAN government, also with Indonesian government. So does ASEAN Charter needs to be revisited? So in order to be less controversial, I don't want to say that ASEAN Charter needs to be replaced or needs to go to irrelevance completely, no. But does ASEAN Charter need to be revisited? Because there has been some major concern about ASEAN not being able to resolve conflicts, but rather only to manage conflicts in the interest of its members. And most of the members of ASEAN states, I would say, not entirely independent in terms of managing their regional presence. Some of them are proxies to the US and China. So this is a hard truth that we need to speak about. So because it does not replicate, it does not solve, it does not set up to solve problems per se. It almost replicate the functions of the UN. But ASEAN has been praised for being able to provide a safe space for the refugees. This is, I would say that it's not just affirmative action from the government, but also this is also by the interventions of the society in common, especially the indigenous religious society. Because when the first, when I believe it was the third unrest in 2017, when the genocide happened, the first institutions who helped the Rohingya people were coming from the Andaman Sea is the people of Aceh. So they have a policy that is very friendly to the Muslim migrants, including the irregular migrants, to integrate them through fraternity and mixed marriages. So this has enabled them to push the government policy, the central government policy, to give the refugees asylum seeker status. So the sequence is very different with the formal mechanisms in the UN or in public knowledge, because this intervention was not coming from the government as a policy product, but it was coming as a policy reaction, or I would say it is a reactionary policy from the government, because it has been pushed by its own people to help the Rohingya people. So And also because the question is whether or not ASEAN Charter is still relevant right now, I would like to talk to explain that there has been many backdoor I would say conversations behind ASEAN stakeholder, because I'm still an active member of CSO stakeholder networks in ASEAN. There has been a very silent conversation about whether or not ASEAN Charter needs to be revisited, because we have a history that when ASEAN came into motions in 1976, there was a conversation, a very crucial or monumental conversations on whether or not ASEAN needs to have a strategic military or defense pact within its member states. So this is to prevent a conflict from eruptions, and also the second is to prevent ASEAN from being a proxy, from engaging in a proxy war between the Cold War actors at the time. And it has been contextualized until today that ASEAN still becoming, the battlefield of these proxies. And this defense and security pact was proposed by Adam Malik. He was a foreign minister of the first foreign minister of Indonesia. However, it was rejected by Vietnam, I believe, and also Philippines, Ramos administrations, the Marcos administrations, because obviously because of the proxy, has been there. So I'll argue that it was too late when ASEAN came into motions. It was at the time when ASEAN is not completely independent from the proxies. So Indonesia has been quite successful in terms of providing affirmative actions. However, Malaysia and Thailand, as the largest destinations after Indonesia in Southeast Asia, have a significantly poor track record in terms of delivering intervention to the refugees. Malaysia has been struggling with authorities not following order from the central government, and also Thailand has been involved in a series of structured mass killing in the Andaman Seas, which involves traffickers. There is a very famous graveyards of the refugees in southern borders of Thailand. So, in conclusions, on my second point is the needs for ASEAN Charter needs to be revisited is because, first of all, most of the ASEAN member states are non-signatories to the major human rights conventions, especially the convention relating to the status of refugees. So this is a major commitment issues for ASEAN to address these issues. And also the second one is, the most important one, and also the most highlighted problem within ASEAN is the trust deficit within ASEAN. The hard fact that ASEAN member states are still, are in a rough patch to trust each other on strategic issues, especially in the proxy war between the US and China. So there is my recommendations in the last meeting with ASEAN stakeholders is to institutionalize what we call as a strategic trust within ASEAN. Try to work on things that relates to interests, to our common interests rather than to our common differences, especially in terms of sensitive issues of the Myanmar crisis. This also leads to my third point regarding the limits of conflict resolutions. The limit of conflict resolutions in Southeast Asia, I argue, is because of the limit of human rights diplomacy in Southeast Asia region. Why human rights? So human rights is very essential in ASEAN's diplomacy, because ASEAN's diplomacy is based on non-violent approach, is based on dialogues approach, is based on a conversational and formal approach. So human rights diplomacy is very important in ASEAN. So that's why ASEAN also has been hailed for having a very structured human right infrastructure through AHA Center, ASEAN human coordinating body for humanitarian intervention, and also the second is IHR, ASEAN Intergovernmental Commissions on Human Rights. However, unfortunately, because as I mentioned before, the capacity of ASEAN is very strictly limited to preventions and promotion. So the rhetoric production has been occupying the space for so long without proper implementations. However, because of this, the existence of these advisory functions, there has been a growing number of CSO networks that opens dialogues and conversations on human rights violations in Myanmar and also outside Myanmar. So people are becoming more aware and being proactive in providing solutions and recommendations. We have over 160 meetings or 180 meetings per year in ASEAN, which is too much with less, implementations. But I can say that the participation of public is very massive. But the questions that we need to have is whether or not those recommendations can be implemented by the government. So because of this progressive venue for open discussions, we tend to be more promotional. However, I think we need to, instead of only being promotional, we need to be to also focus on how we provide protection and also interventions to the government of Myanmar. And also, I would like to also share in my the last part of my third point is the objective of this human rights diplomacy is to produce a compatible human rights language. So this is very important because at times, this is not only once, at times, whenever ASEAN has summits or sideline meetings with Myanmar, whenever an ASEAN delegation incite the word of Rohingya in the conferences, it is more likely that Myanmar delegations will pull themselves out of the room or will dismiss from the room because of the degree of its sensitivity. So meaning that human rights diplomacy in ASEAN is still compromisable, which has so I think we need to work on this level of sensitivity because without being able to say the word, we are not going to be able to resolve the issues. So at least to bring this conversation to the table, to the authority, not only to the CSO, because there's so many recommendations from the CSO networks. My fourth point is on the irregular migrations, on the mixed migration. This is slightly different from my previous 3 points. When we talk about forced migrations, we talk about the consequence of war or conflict. But when we talk about mixed migration, it is a right-based migrations. However, in Southeast Asia, it becomes violent because of the lack of capacity building and also the undocumented migrants. This has caused irregular migrations on land, also on the seas. And also it has led to vulnerability to human rights abuses within ASEAN, which caused so many migrants left unprotected in, even within ASEAN countries. So the conversation in the ASEAN stakeholder right now is to develop what we call as a cooperative approach in identifying these irregular migrants. So there are in previous in last 3 meetings of HR, we focus on the CSO networks focus on speaking about the national labor on migrant agencies, on how they the local authorities across migrations and human rights spectrum try to reduce the irregular movements by having what we call as the national identification system. So the problem in ASEAN is we don't have a digitalized national identification system. We operate on traditional manner, which cause us not to which has a severe causalities to us to not being able to apply identification to foreigners. I believe I speak with the Commissioner of Human Rights in the Philippines that they found a lot of Indonesians and Thai irregular, illegal migrants in the Philippines, undocumented, but not being able to identify them because of the lack of database within ASEAN. So this is also very integral to support the Hanoi Action Plan, which is to promote freer movement of skilled labor, but it needs to also create safe space for labor. I will share to you the documents, the HR study to which I contributed as a reviewer on the migration management for the most vulnerable group within ASEAN. I hope you are keen to deliberate on it after we have this kind of conversations and we can carry on our conversation in the future. My last point is regarding the the status of Timor-Leste within ASEAN and also ASEAN's Indo-Pacific outreach. This is also the most recent conversations within ASEAN on how Timor-Leste, as a country which has a conflictual border history with Indonesia, especially, and also have an economic, conflict with, various ASEAN countries, including Thailand and Singapore, who has been very resistant to its membership in the past. So only last year we have principally admitted Timor-Leste as the 11th member state of the Association of the ASEAN in the 41st ASEAN Summit organized in Phnom Penh. And now under Indonesian chairmanship, we are creating a roadmap for Timor-Leste to assume its full membership in 2024. So with capacity buildings and assistances from ASEAN member states, we hope that Timor-Leste can fully integrate with ASEAN, not only with ASEAN in a regional order, but also to fulfill ASEAN's mandate also in the Pacific, in the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. So this is very important conversations to have, because ASEAN Timor-Leste has a very difficult relationship before, which has caused ASEAN treatment to Timor-Leste after Timor-Leste being separated from Indonesia in 1999. But the close personal ties between Timor-Leste political figures and also Indonesian leadership hierarchy is very helpful in meeting Timor-Leste demand, 11 years of journey to ASEAN membership. And also because of that very important relationship between the two countries, only last year I joined the President Jose Ramos Horta of Timor-Leste and also Ambassador Dino Patijalal of Indonesia, where we work on the declaration on the crisis in Myanmar. So this is a showcase of commitment from Timor-Leste before they enter to ASEAN, that Timor-Leste is on the same page in ASEAN to support ASEAN in ending the crisis in Myanmar. So Timor-Leste has been shifting from a very abstain actor in Myanmar, from being a pro-democratic actor in relations to supporting the ASEANs in solving the crisis in Myanmar. I will be glad to upload the document after this on our joint declaration that was published by the media, major Indonesian and ASEAN media last year. This is also something that I'll be glad to discuss also in our future conversations. And also, as highlighted by our president as we chair the ASEAN Summit, that the priority of ASEAN leadership is to implement the 5-point consensus on Myanmar and also to fully implement ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific under Indonesia chairmanship to deliver maritime security and blue economy. So this is also something that is very important, because ASEAN has been heavily criticized for failing to fulfill the 5-point consensus on Myanmar, but Indonesian government insisted that it is still relevant through its Indo-Pacific approach that is explained further in our blue security architecture plan in the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. Having Timor-Leste in ASEAN is very important because of its geostrategic importance between Southeast Asia and also with Australia. However, this geostrategic location does not resonate with its current capacity, because Timor-Leste has been struggling to integrate with ASEAN economically. So ASEAN needs to work on helping Timor-Leste in fulfilling its SDGs needs, especially on its economic stability and regional stability. So this is also to avoid another venue of proxy war between the US and China through AUKUS and the Quad, through non-violent, non-militaristic exercise to meet the maritime connectivity, economic security, and sustainable development goals. So these are my conclusions from my previous expositions. One is to have to shift the trust deficit in ASEAN to have a strategic trust. This is to inspire also our Indo-Pacific architecture to be more inclusive, more friendly, especially to South Asian nations as our closest neighbors. I always imagine that we will have a reunion of non-alignment movement, but not like in the past, but in a form of creative alignment that Anshuman has explained before, with more dynamics, more cooperation, more inclusivity, and so on, and also to have a more rule-based order in ASEAN to support its Indo-Pacific counterparts. That's all from me. Thank you so much. I'm going to give the floor back to Sydney. Thank you so much, everyone. Look forward to
Thank you
speak
so
more.
much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Satria, for your comments and your analysis on mixed migration and the need for trust within the ASEAN and the Indo-Pacific region to actually address these emerging security concerns, and especially the humanitarian challenges that emanate from these conflicts. With that, we come to an end of the webinar. And Dr. Sinha, we do have 2 questions for you. So before closing the session, I would share those with you. So one of the attendees have asked, could you expand on the traditional and mixed approach of remedy you talked about? And the other question is about so how this the conflict that you talked about, how does this threaten the regional stability in South Asia? And are there any means other than border patrolling to prevent these kind of traditional security challenges? I would just request you to make it brief, because we are already way past our scheduled time.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you so much, Satria. Actually, my presentation flowed from that. And I think in Satria's presentation, one of the big challenges was the idea of protection itself. So the idea of protection, in a way, sets the norms for peace building for us from our perspective, because there is a huge population that has been affected by this conflict that hasn't come to the fore in most media narratives. So the mixed approach that I was talking about, and very quickly, it was essentially that there is a need to map out also the local capacities for peace and recognize what are the pre-existing traditional norms that exist for peace building that are getting overshadowed by external approaches, where we are continuously trying to get the communities together in this perspective of having very state-based negotiations. Rather, I think it's important to have parallel negotiations where the state and non-state actors, the main political negotiations, but also drive community level negotiations over concrete, measurable humanitarian issues that are common across ethnicities. And the implementation of that has to be driven by local organizations who are already based inside the context. But there is a need for having some external participation to be able to at least moderate the process, to be able to shape the process as well. And I think there's a lot of room also for global learnings. I think India can learn a lot also from what's happening in Southeast Asia, some of the trust-based models that Mr. Satria had expounded upon. We can also learn a lot from Latin America. So community peace building, I think, is a very dynamic field with a lot of indigenous practices that have not been used yet for the current conflict. So it needs to be a bit innovative. And from my own personal standpoint, I think the idea of using healthcare for peace building also has to be a priority, because right now, most districts are very badly affected by this kind of attack on health. And these medical supplies have to be allowed in to all districts. So so I think starting very much from humanitarian perspective, combining with traditional norms, but implemented by both external parties who have some semblance of neutrality, but also building on local norms. And also the surrounding states. I think especially Nagaland might have a massive role to play in being a neutral kind of external party in this conflict. There's a lot of potential for that. So that was one. The second part is, I think, the issue of see, I think it goes into Anshuman's presentation in the sense that the communities across the open border have always been linked to each other. And now, once a border line is drawn, a person coming across to meet the family would be seen as illegal. So I think the free movement regime in the Indo-Burma context has still been very successful, because although the drug trade gets visibility, it is not the only, I mean, it is not that determining a factor of the bilateral relationship. And if we overall measure the trade and, if you look at people-to-people linkages, we'll find that the issue of drugs and this illicit migration is a very, very small part. In fact, it's actually a very stable border because of the people-to-people and the cross-community linkages. The coup in Myanmar has, of course, impacted. So we must take into consideration that. But one of the solutions, of course, is that there have been massive deficits in our border areas, especially in terms of lack of institutions, like healthcare institutions. The performing, making these existing government infrastructure effective has been a big challenge in the border areas, because of this reason that they're very remote. Also, there are also pre-existing community systems that are in place. So I think one key, I mean, 2 or 3 key solutions. One would be like huge focus on livelihoods. Second, convergence between all the various government schemes that have been designed for border areas. There needs to be an overarching and, although we have Border Area Development Program, BADP, but it needs to be converged with many other different schemes. And even BADP implementation has come into a lot of bottlenecks when various evaluations of BADP were done. So improving BADP to make it more aligned with community requirements rather than making it just purely from outside template. I think these two would be the solution. And of course, illicit trade, I would say it is there, but I think there's also need to also increase and create more preconditions for the bilateral people-to-people trade beyond the illicit trade that happens. So I think use of formal trade and international trade for conflict resolution in this case, there is some room for that. So, in terms of my answers, I think I'll leave it here, and give the floor to the panelists.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful interacting with all of you and having you as the panelists. I also take this opportunity to thank Dr. Sriparna Pathak and Dr. Panigrahi for playing an instrumental role in organizing this webinar with the Indo-Pacific Circle. And I hope to meeting you all again and interacting more for our further future collaborations. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Satri.
Thank you so much, Samrat. Thank you so much, Sydney. Looking forward to meet you again. Thank you so much for having me. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye.